This is a story from a guy named Brian, who went to college in Colorado back in 2008. He rented a small old house just a few blocks from his campus. It wasn't anything fancy, just a one-bedroom rental with creaky wooden floors and outdated fixtures. But it was cheap, quiet, and perfect for a college student who wanted privacy. At least that's what he thought. For the first few months, everything was fine. He got used to the house's little quirks, how the floors groaned under his feet, how the pipes made weird knocking sounds when he ran the hot water. But then, little things started happening. Things he couldn't explain. It started with his windows. Brian liked to keep them closed, especially at night. But he'd wake up in the morning and find them cracked open, just an inch or two. He figured maybe he was just forgetting. Maybe he opened them before bed and didn't remember. Then food started going missing. Not big things, just little stuff. A granola bar, a piece of fruit, a slice of bread. At first he thought maybe he was just miscounting what he had. Maybe he ate them and forgot. But one night, as he grabbed a beer from the fridge, he noticed something weird. His carton of eggs was turned the wrong way. The labels faced the back of the fridge. He never did that. Again, he brushed it off. Maybe he was overthinking. Maybe he was being paranoid. But then came the noises. Late at night while studying, he'd hear soft creaking from the other room, almost like someone shifting their weight. At first he thought it was just the house settling, but it wasn't. Because one night, he heard something else. Whispers. It happened on a Tuesday night. Brian was sitting at his desk, cramming for an exam. The only sound in the house was the low hum of his desk lamp and the occasional scratch of his pencil. And then, he heard it. A low, breathy whisper. He froze. His heart started pounding. It was so faint, he thought maybe he imagined it. Then he heard it again, coming from inside the walls. Brian sat there, staring at the wall, his whole body on edge. He felt like a deer caught in headlights. The whispering had stopped, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. He stood up slowly, grabbed his phone, and walked to his bedroom, locking the door behind him. He barely slept that night. A few nights later, Brian came home late from the library. He dropped his bag, kicked off his shoes, and headed to the bathroom to splash some water on his face. That's when he saw it. A message, written in condensation on his mirror. Get out. Brian's blood ran ice cold. The thing was, he hadn't even used the shower. He hadn't been home all day. Someone had written it while he was gone. His hands were shaking as he grabbed his phone and called the cops. They arrived within minutes, searched the house but found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no fingerprints, no evidence of an intruder. One officer told him it was probably a prank. Maybe some friends messing with him. But Brian didn't have friends who had a key. A few nights later, Brian woke up gasping. He swore he heard something, soft breathing. The room was pitch black. He could barely hear over his own heartbeat, but there it was, a faint, slow inhale, coming from his closet. Brian sat up, reaching for his bedside lamp. His hands were shaking. He flicked it on, and the breathing stopped. The closet door was open just a crack. Brian hadn't left it open. For a moment he sat there, his mind racing. He tried to convince himself it was just in his head. Maybe it was the air vents. Maybe he was just exhausted. But deep down, he knew something was wrong. Slowly, he grabbed the baseball bat he kept under his bed. His palms were slick with sweat as he crept toward the closet. He reached out, grabbed the handle, and yanked it open. Nothing. Just his clothes, his shoes. Nothing out of the ordinary. But then he noticed something. A hole in the closet wall. Small, barely noticeable. But it was there. A hole that hadn't been there before. And then, it hit him. The noises. The missing food. The whispers. The sounds weren't coming from the closet. They were coming from inside the walls. Brian called the police again. This time, they searched every inch of the house. And that's when they found it. Behind a panel in his closet was a hidden crawl space. Inside, they found a dirty sleeping bag, food wrappers, and a knife. Someone had been living inside the walls, watching Brian, moving around while he slept. The worst part? The police never caught him. Whoever it was, he was gone. Brian packed his things and left the house the next day. He never looked back. This story is terrifying because it could happen to anyone. Imagine living alone, thinking you're safe, only to find out that someone is watching you, living inside your walls, sneaking around when you're asleep. Would you stay in a house after finding out someone was hiding inside your walls? Or would you get out? And remember, always check your walls. There's a place in India called Kuldhara. It's an abandoned village left untouched for over 200 years. The entire population, over 1,500 people, vanished overnight. No records, no bodies, no clear explanation. Some say they fled. Some say they were cursed. And anyone who tries to stay there overnight never comes back. In 1999, a team of researchers decided to prove the legends were fake. One of them, Vikram, shared his experience. He doesn't talk about it much anymore, because the night he spent in Kuldhara changed him forever. Vikram was an archaeologist working for a history research institute. He didn't believe in ghosts or curses. He believed in facts. And to him, the story of Kuldhara was just that, a story. So when his team planned a 3-night stay in the village to document its history, he was excited. This was the kind of work he lived for. The group consisted of 6 people: Vikram, 2 other researchers, a journalist, and 2 local guides. When they arrived, the silence was the first thing Vikram noticed. The village was dead quiet. No wind, no birds, no sounds at all. Just stillness. As they walked through the ruins, Vikram felt something off. The air felt thick, heavy, like it was pressing against his skin. The village was a maze of crumbling houses, empty streets, and dried-up wells. Some of the houses still had furniture, plates, and belongings, as if the people had just stood up and left. Their guide seemed nervous. They refused to enter certain areas and kept whispering prayers. That should have been the first warning. But Vikram wasn't scared, not yet. They set up their camp in the center of the village near an old temple. Their plan was to document everything: photographs, audio recordings, temperature readings. As the sun set, the real unease began. Around midnight, they started hearing footsteps. At first, they thought it was an animal, but then they realized the steps were too deliberate, too slow. One of the researchers, Anil, shined his flashlight toward the sound. Nothing, just the empty ruins. But the second he turned the light away, the footsteps started again. Vikram, trying to stay logical, said it was just an echo. The village was old, and sound bounced off the structures. But deep down, he wasn't convinced, because the footsteps weren't just random, they were getting closer. At around 2 a.m., the journalist Ria called out, "Who's that?" Everyone turned. She was pointing toward a narrow alley between 2 broken houses. And that's when they saw it, a figure, just standing there. At first, they thought it was one of their guides, but then they realized their guides were inside the tent. This wasn't one of them. The figure was tall, thin, and completely still. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, watching. Ria slowly raised her camera and took a picture. The flash illuminated the alley for a split second, and the figure was gone. No sound, no movement, just gone. That's when the guides refused to stay any longer. They begged the researchers to leave, but Vikram and his team were stubborn. They weren't ready to leave yet. That was their mistake. At 3:30 a.m., Vikram was alone, writing in his notebook when he heard something. A voice, a woman's whisper, soft, mournful, coming from one of the nearby houses. The words were incoherent, but they sent a chill down his spine. He slowly turned his flashlight toward the house. The whispering stopped. The doorway was pitch black. But then, in the darkness, he saw her. A woman, standing just beyond the doorway. Her eyes were hollow, her face sunken. She was smiling. A slow, stretched-out grin. Vikram's entire body locked up. He tried to move to call out, but he couldn't. The woman took a step forward, then another. Her smile widened. Vikram's breath hitched. His vision blurred. His head felt heavy. The last thing he remembered was collapsing to the ground. When Vikram woke up, it was morning. He was outside, lying in the dirt. His team was gathered around him, looking terrified. They told him he had been screaming in his sleep, thrashing, foaming at the mouth. They tried to wake him, but he wouldn't move. It wasn't until sunrise that he finally stopped. Vikram had no memory of what happened after he saw the woman, but something felt wrong. His body felt drained, like something had been taken from him. They packed up and left immediately. None of them spoke the entire ride back. But Vikram knew they were lucky to have made it out. A week later, Vikram quit his job. He refused to study Kuldara ever again. But here's the scariest part. Ria, the journalist, went through the photos she took that night. And in one of them, the one she took of the shadow figure, there was something else. Behind it, inside the alley, was the whispering woman, standing right behind Vikram, smiling. Kuldara remains abandoned. The locals say the spirits of the villagers never left, that they still wander the ruins, searching for something. Or maybe they're waiting for the next visitors. Would you spend the night in a cursed village? And remember, some places should be left alone. This story happened to a woman named Lena in 2016 when she was living in Seattle. At the time, she worked late shifts at a bookstore. She would get off work at 2 a.m. and walk home. It was only about a 10-minute walk. She had always felt safe. The streets were empty, quiet. Nothing ever happened. Until one night, when she saw him. The first encounter. It was a Thursday night. Cold, foggy. Lena had just locked up the bookstore and started walking home, listening to music. That's when she noticed something. A man standing across the street. At first, she didn't think much of it. But as she kept walking, so did he. He wasn't just walking, though. He was skipping. Not like a child, not playful. It was unnatural. His arms hung stiffly by his sides and his legs jerked with each step. And then, he turned his head toward her. That's when she saw his face. He was grinning, not a normal smile. It was too wide, too stretched. His eyes were locked onto her, unblinking as he continued skipping forward. Lena's stomach dropped. She sped up. The man did too, still skipping, still grinning. The following. Lena's apartment was only a few blocks away. She kept moving, forcing herself not to panic. Maybe he was just some drunk guy messing around. But then, he did something that made her heart stop. He stopped skipping and started running. Not toward her, but at full speed in the opposite direction, straight into an alley. Lena's blood turned to ice. Because that alley? It cut through to her street. She ripped out her earbuds and started running. By the time she reached her block, she was out of breath. Her chest was tight. She looked around frantically and then she saw him, standing at the end of her street, perfectly still, waiting, smiling. Lena sprinted to her apartment and locked the door behind her. She didn't turn on the lights. She didn't want him to see where she lived. Slowly, she crept toward her window. He was still there, standing under the streetlight, grinning up at her building. Then, he tilted his head. Not like a normal head tilt. It was too slow, too exaggerated. Lena's hands were shaking. She pulled the curtain closed, backed away, and grabbed her phone. She thought about calling the cops, but what would she even say? A guy smiled at me? Instead, she called her friend Jake, who lived 2 blocks away. He picked up immediately. "Lena? What's wrong?" She couldn't even speak. Then, a knock at the window. Lena's heart nearly stopped. She turned. The curtain was still closed, but there was a shadow, a tall, thin silhouette. He was right outside. She dropped her phone. The shadow moved, slowly, creeping along the glass. Then, the handle of her front door rattled. Lena grabbed a knife from the kitchen and dialed 911. The dispatcher could hear the terror in her voice. They said a patrol car was 3 minutes away. 3 minutes. It felt like an eternity. The door handle rattled again. Then, silence. Lena held her breath. She was shaking so hard she thought she might pass out. Finally, she heard sirens. She ran to the peephole. The hallway was empty. By the time the cops arrived, he was gone. Lena gave the police a description, but they never found him. The weirdest part? She wasn't the only one. Over the next few weeks, more people came forward. Different women, different neighborhoods, but all describing the same man, skipping, smiling, watching. They never caught him. Some people think he was just some psycho who liked to follow people, but others believe something else, something worse. Because one woman, a year later, claimed she saw him again, standing outside her window, still smiling, still watching, and when she turned away for just 1 second, he was inside. Would you know if someone was watching you? Would you hear them before it was too late? Let me know in the comments. And remember, some smiles aren't friendly.